Good afternoon. Welcome back. We will call the meeting back to order. All right. And some housekeeping first. I want to look at the minutes from both February 15th on our joint committee. Representative Sanders, have you had time to review those minutes?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'll move the minutes from February 15th.
Representative Sanders moves the minutes February 15th. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Those minutes are approved. And Representative Sanders, also April 23rd, 2015.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll move the minutes from April 23rd.
Representative Sanders moves the minutes of April 23rd, 2015. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Same sign. Those minutes are passed. All right. And what?
We should welcome the new pages and introduce themselves and then introduce our committee
Wonderful.
legislative assistant and our new member.
Real ID. When I was a kid, there and big figures gives a fake.
Okay. And a couple other things to highlight. I would like, at this point in time, of our pages, we have more than one page right now. Could you come down and introduce yourself and just one today?
Thank you. My name is Sean Reibel. I'm a 2014 graduate of St. John's. If there are any Tommies in the room that need to have a chat with me, I'll meet you out in the hallway. This is my first position with the House. I'm really excited to be here. I'm also paging for higher ed, Greater Minnesota, and property tax. So, thank you.
Great, welcome. Thank you very much. And also, we have a new committee assistant, Josh Anderson, is with us. Josh, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. Josh Anderson. I'm a 2014 graduate of Southwest State University in Marshall, Minnesota, born and raised in Springfield, Minnesota, which is Brown County. Representative Paul Torkelson's my state representative. So happy to be here at the committee, happy to be working with Chairman Kelly, and looking forward to a good session. And Representative Nash is my other member as well. Also looking forward to working with him.
Thank you, Josh. And finally, our new representative on the committee, Representative Chad Anderson. Chad, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chad Anderson, wife and 4 kids, ages 6, 4, 3, and 1. So I stay busy with that. Just excited to be on this committee and really excited to be here at the Capitol.
Welcome, Representative Anderson. We're very excited to have you with us. All right, on to the agenda of today. We will be hearing House File. Do we have a House File? 1732. Representative Smith.
So we don't do it. Said you couldn't.
Representative Smith, would you like to make some opening comments?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, members. I have a delete all amendment to House File 1732.
Representative Smith, I understand that'll be an oral amendment.
Or no, he has to delete all.
You have delete all
He has to
amendment.
delete all for the whole.
Okay.
Put it in place for-
Okay. So I will move the DE1 amendment to House File 1732 to get that in the place that the author would like that. Yeah, getting a little feedback. As I said, I'll move the DE1 amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. That motion carries. And Representative Smith, do you also have an oral amendment?
I do, Mr. Chair. Shall I walk through that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Please.
Mr. Chair, I would like to move the delete all everything amendment as follows. Page 3, line 1, delete everything after the number 2. Page 3, line 1, delete everything after 2. In addition, page 3, line 10, delete everything before the period. And then finally, page 3, delete the entire subdivision 7. and then
Thank you.
amend the title accordingly.
Thank you, Representative Smith, and I believe we'll have Mr. Burris walk us through that.
Mr. Chair and members, the first one is a slight modification. It would be page 3, line 9, delete everything after 2. Page 3, line 10, delete everything before the period. Page 3, delete subdivision 7.
Everyone like that read again? We'll do that one more time, please, Mr. Burris.
Mr. Chair and members, page 3, line 9, delete everything after 2. That's the number 2. Page 3, line 10, delete everything before the period. Page 3, delete subdivision 7.
Were there any questions on that?
Actually,
Representative Clark.
thank you, Mr. Chair.
Or Representative Johnson, sorry.
Do I understand this then, that on 3.10 and 3.11 stay, the commissioner may not expend state funds remains in the bill?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Any other clarification on the oral amendment? Okay, I will move that oral amendment then. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Amendment passes. Representative Dreskowski.
Mr. Chair, just wondering, and maybe for the author, on line 3.10 as amended, the word "other," is that kind of an extraneous word at this point? Can that go away, Representative Smith?
Mr. Chair, members, I believe that it could, and I hesitate to take it out now only because we're working closely with the Senate. A similar bill has passed through the Senate with that word in, and there is a lot of discussions with the Senate about trying to match the language. And I'm open to taking that word out, although I have not discussed that with the Senate author specifically, but I'm willing to do so before the next stop.
And members, the next stop would be government operations, so if this does pass through here, that's where this is headed.
I believe, Mr. Chair, I believe it's going to Ways and Means.
It's going to ways. No, yeah, we don't have to go about it because they took the rulemaking out.
I stand corrected. Thank you. So we'll go to Ways and Means. Okay. All right, with that, Representative Smith, to your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. As I mentioned, this bill has similar language that has been working through the Senate. I've been working very closely with the Senate in having a bill that has broad bipartisan support to start in phase 1, or part 1, if you will, of the Real ID bill. Specifically, this bill gives authority and direction to the Department of Public Safety concerning the Federal Real ID Act. It provides directing and department to begin planning, specify various planning activities, requiring a legislative report, which is due at the end of this month, March 31st, on planning and implementation analysis. It limits the use of state funds strictly to the planning piece of it. It directs the department to seek an extension that would lift current federal restrictions on the use of Minnesota-issued driver's license and ID cards to enter federal facilities and government federal facilities, and also military facilities as well. Also requires department to provide testimony, information, and fiscal notes related to Real ID. And lastly, it repeals the current Real ID prohibition. As I mentioned, this is step 1 in the process. This bill simply allows planning and ideas to be discussed for a second bill that will be forthcoming at some later date.
Thank you, Representative Smith. We do have some questions. Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for bringing this forward. I just have a question that relates to the oral amendment, and in subdivision form, and it may be just for council if you can't answer it, but it's my understanding that the commissioner, the DPS commissioner, will still retain some authority on driver's license. There's broad authority, I think it's section 171 under, that deals with driver's license. Is that also stopped in this amendment?
Mr. Burris, would you like to comment on that?
Mr. Chair, Representative Hornstein, yes, it's Chapter 171 of the statutes lays out the driver licensing provisions, and within that, the commissioner has authority around administering driver's licensing requirements of how the program is administered, and there are a couple of provisions in that chapter on rulemaking. And I would read this bill as being silent as to the rulemaking and administrative powers that exist under that chapter. So this is more specific to the planning and implementation activities related directly to Real ID.
So, Mr. Chair, and so that is concerning because if it's silent, then I don't know if we've actually done perhaps what the author really wants to do here, because there still may be some ability to expend funds. Would that be correct, Mr. Burris, even with this revised language?
Mr. Burris.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hornstein, on implementation of or administration of driver licensing generally, the statutes hold. This is more, there is a provision here narrowing the use of state funds for Real ID. So I think it's reasonable to expect the department to view this as curtailing their use of the state appropriations for driver services to just the planning activities that are listed out in that subdivision 2 of the
Thank you,
bill.
Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make sure we had that clarification on the record here.
Thank you, Representative Hornstein. Representative Earhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know what I'm looking at here, but I've got something that tells me we're spending $60 million on this plus. Am I correct, or are we authorizing that amount of money, or how much are we authorizing for this thing?
Lee.
Mr. Chair and Representative Earhart, currently the Department of Driver and Vehicle Services in the Vehicle Services budget area receives $30.7 million a year from a special revenue fund from fees for driver services, and that's just for the sort of day-to-day operations of driver services. And what Subdivision 4 refers to is that those funds would be available for the activities lined out in this legislation.
Well, Mr. Chairman, why are we spending $60 million to change over to a different type of driver's license? Or is this for does this cover everything in the whole world that we're going to do with this, or what? That seems like a lot of money. I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
Mr. Lee.
Mr. Chair and Representative Earhart, no, the $60 million over the fiscal 16-17 biennium is to run driver services. It's not specific.
It's not for this specific for this. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Representative Lucero. Representative Jaskowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the author's diligence in communicating with the Senate author going forward. I'm still troubled and curious about the word other. I'm wondering if Mr. Burris could kind of tune us into that there too. The way I read it, it may imply to the department that they have somehow inherently some sort of ability to spend funds with the existence of the word other there. It seems to me that they may take that to mean that they inherently already have some sort of authority. Mr. Burris?
Mr. Burris.
Mr. Chair, Representative Drazkowski, the interpretation of that would really be on the department. My reading of it is first that the term was originally in the context of rulemaking being part of what was authorized under the delete all amendment, and so eliminating the rulemaking, as you had raised earlier, raises a question about what other really means in the context of this section. setting aside the department's existing statutory authority on driver licensing administration, there could potentially be a window here for the department to view other implementation as providing some leeway on use of state dollars. On the other hand, the context of that whole subdivision is to limit the department's capability to expend state dollars. So I really defer to the department to respond to how they would view the language if it were enacted as it currently reads.
Representative Drazkowski.
And Mr. Chair and Mr. Burris, that's what I would be afraid of. Thank you.
Representative Runbeck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have this overview here of what the program is, but I wonder if Representative Smith, could you just, I mean, how are things going to be better? I guess if we go to this as new license, driver's license, and what documents, I mean, are we, as we go and renew ours, going to have to produce, you know, those of us who've had driver's licenses, are we going to have to produce a lot of new documentation, or just what is the burden on normal people to have a Real ID compliant license?
Representative Smith.
Mr. Chair, Representative, those questions cannot be answered with this bill, for this bill does not deal with what the new licensing requirements for the state will be. That is an issue for after this bill hopefully becomes law, and the 2009 session law is repealed. At that point, different ideas will be discussed, and the types of documents and what the impact of that is for our citizens of Minnesota, as well as for the department, would be better spoken to at that point.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from members? Okay. Representative Drazkowski.
Mr. Chair, can the department come up and take questions? Are they here?
We do have a couple of testifiers that we're going to hear first.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep. Any other questions at this point in time from members? Okay. Then we have Representative Hornstein.
I just, I'm not one of these real process stickler on the rules type of people. However, I was just shown that I've never really done this before. Under 4.16, bills affecting government data practices, it seems like this might have some, impact on that. And so is there a reason why we're just going right to Ways and Means rather than civil law?
Yeah. I guess the word that we've got, Representative Hornstein, is that civil law didn't request it. And so I guess that's where we're taking direction from.
I've always wanted to do that. So.
All right. So noted. You are now on record.
Yeah.
You can run on that now.
Yeah. The rule.
Okay. At this point in time, we have the Chamber of Commerce. Ms. Borderline, please. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Laura Bordelon with the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. We wanted to express our support for the bill and for the efforts by the working group to have Minnesota driver license become compliant with Real ID. I don't have extensive testimony, but do appreciate the work going forward for the state to be in compliance.
Thank you, Ms. Bordelon. Welcome. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for testifying. My question is, it would seem to me that there could be some issues with the current license structure that it can limit access to federal buildings and certainly military bases. Do you see an advantage for Minnesota Commerce in having that access? And is that your support, basis of your support?
Ms. Bordelon.
Mr. Chair and Representative, that is correct.
Representative Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And then my follow-up question would be, in the interest of the chamber, or in the interest of that sort of commerce, is there value in moving this faster rather than slower, both this bill and then also the other, the second bill that will be coming?
Ms. Bordelon.
Mr. Chair and Representative, we do support the efforts by the legislature to move this along quickly. We are supportive of this bill for planning purposes and are hopeful that the Minnesota driver's license will become compliant as soon as possible.
Any other questions? Thank you, Ms. Bordelon.
You're welcome.
Is Ms. Braze here? Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record.
Good evening, Mr. Chair. My name is Twyla Braze. I'm president of Citizens Council for Health Freedom. And we have long been concerned with Real ID because we look at it as a national ID card. It has 100 federal requirements that are attached to it. And so we don't look at it as a state ID or an additional kind of a state ID, but actually a national ID card. So this particular bill calls for the allowing the planning, and we look at planning for Real ID as simply the first step towards that national ID card. Now, if the planning were simply about research or looking into, you know, what it entailed, that would be different. But if you're actually planning for implementation, that causes us a concern. So I can't remember who mentioned the money. Over here mentioned the money. So we did look at the money, and the Chicago Tribune mentions that in Illinois it's going to cost $50 to $60 million to implement the Real ID system, and so we certainly hope that when you get a fiscal note, you'll have a note that tells you the actual cost of doing so. I would like to draw to your attention for the privacy concerns that there is a long list, about 2.5 pages worth, called the Privacy Coalition. It is left and right leaning groups that are all concerned about it being a national ID card. Additionally, in the rules, it talks about there having to be a hub, a federal hub, and then there has to be state-to-state exchange. So the database that has to be created under the federal law is a database that all states, other states must have access to, as well as the federal government, leading, of course, to the possibility of a significant risk of hacking into this new database that will have all this new, all this identification information. In addition to that, we're concerned, even though it mentions that you're going to look at the single track, so Real ID and nothing else, or dual track, where you will have both Real ID and you'll have a regular state ID as an option. We're concerned that once you move in that direction, and because of the cost of having a dual system, that you won't actually keep it. And so the privacy concerns that we have about the Real ID, there won't be any option in order to even drive a car in this state other than to have the Real ID. Former DHS Secretary Michael Chertoff in 2008, which was 3 years after the Real ID passed at the federal level, he described his vision of using Real IDs, and he said it would be to cash a check, hire a babysitter, board a plane, or engage in countless other activities. And that, Mr. Chair, is our concern, because we know that the law says that the Secretary of Homeland Security is allowed to decide what the purposes are. So the law actually says that the Secretary can expand the purposes of Real ID at will. Doesn't have to go back to Congress, can just decide. Now, from our organization as a health freedom organization, what we realize that that means is that we could end up with the Real ID being our national patient ID. And there is a law called HIPAA that requires a unique patient identifier already. But in 1999, there was a law passed at the federal level that forbids funding for it. So we look at this as a backdoor to a national patient identifier, a no card, no care kind of a process. And if you've ever been to the doctor recently, you'll see that some of the doctors are asking you for your card. They're asking you because of federal red flags regulation that at one point they thought they had to follow, and a 2010 law said that they don't, but they're still doing it. So we expect that we would not be able to access care without it being tracked through this Real ID. So the last thing that I'd like to say is that the U.S. Constitution says that the state cannot be commandeered by the federal government in order to implement and fund a federal law. Real ID is a federal law, and the reason that we are 11 years past the 2005 enactment of this law is because there are no penalties for the state of Minnesota. And if you took it to the U.S. Supreme Court, they would say the federal government, they'd likely say that the federal government has to fund and implement its own law and issue us all a national ID card called Real ID. So this is essentially a way to get Minnesota to not let the people of Minnesota understand that it is a national ID card, all under the federal government, all under the federal regulators, and to have the state of Minnesota and taxpayers actually fund this process. Now, one thing you just need to know about flying and the threat that you can't fly is that the Homeland Security already told the state of Illinois that their citizens would be able to fly. It's just that they would need additional security checks. In addition to that, the Department of Homeland Security says on their fact sheet that enhanced driver's licenses can be used instead. They can be used to board a plane. Minnesota has an enhanced driver's license. So we look at the threat as a way to try and get you to do what states do not have to do and do not have to fund. So we are opposed to it, and we're opposed to a national ID. And to Representative Hornstein's comment about civil law, absolutely should go to civil law, and we are very surprised that civil law and data practices has not asked for this, because it is a significant concern, particularly the hub and the databases that have to be created, the national connected system of databases. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any questions? Representative Sanders? You on the list? Okay. Representative Horns or Representative Earhart?
I have a question first for you or Council. Mr. Chairman, do we have a deadline on this, getting this passed yet? There have been something mentioned a couple of times, but do we actually have a deadline when this has to be done? Does anybody know about?
This particular bill?
No, the Real ID. Issuing a certificate that lets us get on airplanes.
Mr. Burris.
Mr. Chair, Representative Earhart, there are a couple of dates that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has expressed for how they're going to handle the next couple of stages with enforcement of the requirements for, acceptance at federal facilities is already in place. So the next date is January 22nd, 2018, and that's the date when TSA is not going to accept identification issued by a state that's not either Real ID compliant or operating under an extension. So that wouldn't, as a sole form of identification, wouldn't be accepted starting in 2018. The second date is October 1st of 2020, and that's the date that DHS has indicated is the kind of hard date that no more extensions would be available starting then, so that for IDs to be accepted on federal facilities that are secured, as well as for boarding aircraft, the identification would need to be Real ID compliant.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I was going to ask the witness, I didn't realize this time zone had spread out. I thought we were in a much shorter window here. So what do we do, how do we get on planes after 2018 or 2020 if we don't have this device, the certificate, or whatever we want to call it?
So, Mr. Chair
Great.
and Representative, I'm sorry, I have forgotten your name.
I have that same trouble myself.
Okay, then, I'm in good company. So several things. Again, the department told the Chicago Tribune, but the state of Illinois, that people would still be able to get on planes. It's not that they wouldn't be able to get on planes. It would be that they would have additional security requirements. And again, the Department of Homeland Security says in their fact sheet that the enhanced driver's license also works. And Minnesota is one of 5 states with an enhanced driver's license. And the last thing is this right here from Homeland Security, where the 4th stage of enforcement, number 4 is called the aircraft acceptable only with second form of ID, which is to be implemented no sooner than 2016. So as long as you have a second ID, an it doesn't have, you can go on a plane. It's not like you have to have a real ID to go on a plane. This is why I have said that this is just a threat that the department has said, but they can't actually enforce.
Thank you. I think we've strayed far from this bill, so I'm going to get us back on track. I understand there's a member of the public that would like to testify. Is he still here?
Mr. Chairman?
Just stepped out.
I had
Representative
people
Earhart.
come home from California, particularly to file for the other ID so that they could travel after January 1. Because that was the word at that time, and that was what everybody spread around. I don't know why we can't openly talk about what the hell is the date and what is the penalty. But I mean, I had people call me from California, two families out there that came home early from their vacation so they could get the special ID and then they could go out of town on January, which was all a big hoax.
Sure. I appreciate that, Representative Earhart, but what you did hear, from Mr. Burris, there's the dates definitely have been pushed back to that 2018 time period. What we're talking about here in this legislation is a repeal of the 2005 law. So I think that answer in itself should help your constituents who have those
Too
questions.
late. They already came home and did the whole thing, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is related to your comment or Mr. Burris, that's true for getting on an airplane. Is it also true, have the dates been extended for getting onto a military base or into a federal building? And the reason I'm asking is I have a constituent who was unable to visit her son on a military base because she didn't have the right ID, and I was wondering if that was handled appropriately.
Representative Johnson, you would still need to use a passport to get into those facilities. Is that correct? You can get in, but now you're required to use a passport. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, yes, right. The DHS had several stages of enforcement of what types of secured federal facilities would require a Real ID compliant form of identification or identification issued by a state that had an extension. So there was a series of stages, and so Minnesota, as not having an extension and not having a Real ID compliant license, is one of those states where just the ID or driver's license is not accepted to get onto military bases or enter secured federal facilities currently. And just to Representative Earhart's question earlier, some of the communication last fall and information in the media was not entirely accurate from what I had seen. At that point, DHS had indicated that sometime after January 1, the airline requirement would kick in, and they subsequently delayed that, and that's the new date is now 2018.
Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the committee record.
Yes, Commissioner, Chairman Kelly, my name is Tim Nolan, Senate District 65, former Senate 61, Frank Hornstein was my representative. I'm here today on behalf of We the People. The one on page 2 of the handout here, the statement, I would go to matter for the record. Source of identification are the last opportunity to ensure people who are there to say they are or not to check whether they are terrorists. When I ran for mayor of Minneapolis in 2005, somebody asked the question, I said, it's sad but true, since 9/11, everyone has become a suspect. I heard already in the record about the cost factor. What another layer of security does this country need? The alleged 19 terrorists are in that commission, had 12, had nothing, were not anywhere in sight. They're also the detainees in Guantanamo have been held there long overdue. There's more priorities for the millions of dollars that are put in the set that we can put back into education and health education, because we always seem to find money for war, but we never find money for health and education to make us a prosperous nation and a healthy nation. Furthermore, since 9/11, when my working years, I was a mound firefighter. I was also arson and fire marshal. I became suspicious of the surroundings, and I'm also one of the very few members of the National Firefighters that want 9/11 truth, because we the people, we want the truth, the really true facts. We want to have disclosed the 28 pages redacted in the 9/11 Commission report, because I took the oath as a Marine, I took the oath as a firefighter, all around the room here took that oath that we have to protect. Who are the enemies? And there's just other priorities we have to get in line. I also concern about my medical records, which has already been stated in the record. If I already have 2 labels on my medical records, I've already met and challenged the one, and I went on the other. In cyberspace, I've already had my checking accounts has been attacked 3 times just this past year. Back in March of 2002, I had identifying my credit cards were stolen, and because the police did a thorough report, I had to go to court. I challenged Capital One. I beat them in one court, and I went to another court. But getting together, we already are a safe country. We have more military than any other country. We have more military bases. We have over 900 bases across the globe. I'm hoping this stays in the same focus. I don't want to sound like I'm all over the map, but I think we got to really, we have a surplus in the budget. Why spend more money to have another layer? We already had, since I had my driver's license stolen back then, I lobbied and got the one. Now we have the picture ID. If you ever have your license stolen, it's given a new number. Prior to that, the number stayed the same no matter whatever. But I had the regulation, if I ever get stopped, they had to show 3 picture IDs. But and again, as far as the fact for we the people, and you people representing the people, that we've got to get the focus back away. We have surveillance since 9/11, the 2 growth industries, surveillance and security, TSA, every cameras, surveillance cameras. It's a growth industry. I love to have stock in that. It's a company right here in St. Paul. But anyway, I'm very frustrated. Having been a firefighter, 343 of my brothers are still screaming for justice. The crime scene of the century, Governor Giuliano cleared the wreckage. Somewhere my brothers are some in landfill or on a barge that went off to China. But anyway, I thank you for your time and get the focus back on the people. Thank you for
Mr.
your
Nolan.
time.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the audience from the public who would like to testify on House File 1732?
Did he vote for you?
All right. And to Representative Jaskowski's question, is there anyone from DPS here? I do not see anyone. Representative Jaskowski. Are there any other?
Mr. Chair?
Representative Jaskowski.
Was DPS aware of the meeting?
I believe they were.
Wow. I've got some more questions if I could, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Representative Jaskowski.
Thank you. And this might be for the author and also for Mr. Burris. Lines 1.18, 1.19 of the bill. We will no longer need the words under subdivision 7. And those could be eliminated, I believe.
I don't think we need.
And then
We removed 7.
I'm wondering if the author would entertain removal of those words, or maybe he needs to check with the Senate author too, but
Mr. Burris, since we removed subsection 7, would that be appropriate to remove that language?
Mr. Chair, yes, I think that would be a technical clarifying change if the committee wanted to take up that amendment.
Mr. Chair, I'd move to, on line 1.18, delete the word under, and on 1.19, delete the word subdivision and the number 7. And I think that's it. Or whatever else Mr. Burris would add to that.
I think that's the only reference to subsection 7, or subdivision 7.
And Mr. Chair, maybe a question for Mr. Burris as we're doing this. Do we even need that item?
That item being
that item II there.
1.18.
Correct.
Burris?
Mr. Chair, Representative Drazkowski, the effect of that item is to direct the department to identify how Minnesota currently isn't compliant from the standpoint of its administrative rules. So including this would have the department identify and report back on what kind of anticipated rulemaking they would undertake if authorized to fully implement. So there would be substantive information that the legislature would receive. Yeah.
Okay.
So the oral amendment would be to take out on 1.18 under and on 1.19 subdivision 7. Would that be correct? No, because that be your understanding, Representative Drazkowski?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Representative Drazkowski moves an oral amendment that would remove on 1.18 the word under and on 1.19 subdivision 7 : Any questions? All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. The motion passes. More questions? Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, Mr. Burris, on line 1.24, the words "or seeking implementation guidance." I just wrote a note here. It says, "What is this?" Mr. Burris, can you give us some context on what that means?
Mr. Burris.
Mr. Chair, Representative Drazkowski, in determining what kinds of changes might be necessary to both statutes and rules, I would read that seeking implementation guidance directive to be a component that, or a provision that would direct the department to be in contact with DHS about what aspects of statutes and rules currently would need to be changed in order for the state's ultimate compliance package, assuming that's submitted, to be accepted. So, there are a couple of issues that we've identified through the working group process that are likely necessary changes in statute and possible necessary changes in administrative rules. There's the potential that DHS would take a slightly different interpretation and might, indicate one way or another as to whether some changes were necessary in order to meet compliance or not. So this would this provision would provide something to the department to communicate with DHS about what those aspects and details are.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Burris. One other question, Mr. Burris. The bill directs the department to undertake planning activities and then says that by the 31st of this month, which would be, 20 days from now or so, or less than 20 days, that they would issue a report. Am I reading the way this is put together, that the report to the legislature may not be the entire planning, may not contain all the planning information that they do? It may be just a sampling, if you will, of what the department has done or understood about these items at that point in time? That's kind of how I read it, or I'm just wondering what the relationship is between their overall planning effort in the bill and the report on the 31st, whether that's going to be a complete report and they will have it all done and we'll see everything that they've done in the planning and that's the end of their planning and we're going to see the end of their planning and everything included in that report, or whether we're just going to see what they've learned up until that point, realizing that maybe there will be more going on beyond that. So I'm not sure which of those two it is.
Mr. Burris.
Mr. Chair, Representative Drazkowski, I imagine it's something somewhere in between those two. I'm hesitant to speak too much for the department because, again, it would this is a directive to them, and they would go with, they would, take this language and proceed. But I I think it's reasonable to expect that by the end of March, the department will not have completed all of its planning efforts related to Real ID, that is a very compressed time frame to produce all of the information, get all of the guidance, go through all of the steps that are probably involved with Real ID. So from that standpoint, it's likely a snapshot that would come back to the legislature at the end of March. The reporting directive does specifically call out that each of the planning items should be included. And if the department were to come back with a report that said we've not commenced, we have no information regarding items 2, 3, or 4, the legislative response would presumably not be especially positive. So I wouldn't anticipate the department to be too thin on that, but at the same time, I don't know how much information they will be able to assemble in this kind of time frame.
Representative Sanders, to that point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Representative Drazkowski. Subdivision 6, I think, should provide some extra comfort that upon request of a House committee or Senate committee, the Commissioner of Public Safety or their representatives have to appear before legislative committees. So, I think actually there's some great language in here that allows us to call the department in basically at our request to get updates on planning and fiscal impacts.
And in that regard, we are reminded, Representative Drazkowski, since you were inquiring about the department being here, if we pass this bill, then they could be here. So this repealer would allow them to be there. The current law forbids them to be here doing any work on the Real ID. So that's why the DPS would not be here and would not be able to comment on this in regards to any Real ID work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I find that interpretation very interesting. I mean, this is a committee hearing, and we're simply looking at legislation. So, I don't know. I just think it's past 5 o'clock, and it's time to check out. I don't know what's going on here, Mr. Chair. I don't know how we can proceed with this bill without the department here. There's a lot of questions unanswered. I don't know what the timeline is for this bill, but we may want to hold it over and make certain the department's here and that we hear from them on this, because this is a committee that'll hear that information.
Well, Representative Drazkowski, I do believe, though, that is the conundrum we are in, because the 2005 law actually forbids them. I think if you talk to Mr. Lee, he can't get a fiscal note because DPS cannot assist in that regard. Is that correct? Mr. Lee?
Mr. Chair and members, I have not requested a fiscal note on this legislation, but I would assume that the statute that would govern the legislature receiving fiscal notes from agencies and the session law that forbid DPS from planning may be in conflict there. So,
right. So I think that's the bill in front of us is the way we're viewing it is simply a repeal of that so that we can get to the questions that we're all asking and get to that stage, would be my interpretation.
Well, Mr. Chair, just an observation, it would be the most strict adherence to the law that I've seen a government agency in this state ever comply with.
Then you would be very excited to hear that, wouldn't you?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions from members? Representative Smith, closing comments.
Mr. Chair, members, I ask for your support. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will move House File 1732 as amended, be passed and re-referred to the Committee on Ways and Means. All those in favor? Any discussion, I guess? Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The motion carries. Do we have another committee date?
We're meeting Wednesday, 12:45.
Members, we will be meeting Wednesday, 12:45 in the basement. Do we have a session?
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Okay. With that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.